Hi everyone, and welcome to 15 Photography Tips for Beginners. Today I'm just going to give you 15 quick tips to help you progress on your photography journey. Tip number 1. Shoot in RAW format. Most cameras these days give you an option of what sort of file you can shoot in. RAW will give you the most information in your file and therefore the most options for editing. Even if you're not up to the editing stage in your photography journey, you can shoot in JPEG and RAW at the same time and come back to your RAW files for editing at a later date. Tip number 2, composition. Basically, composition is what you fill your frame with and how you fill it with that subject. There are many rules to composition. One of them is the rule of thirds, where instead of putting your subject in the middle of the frame, you put it to one side or the other on an imaginary thirds line. Some cameras come with a thirds grid overlay, which can line up your subject directly on the thirds line. You can also use the rule of thirds for landscapes. Putting the horizon on the thirds line will give you either more foreground or more sky, depending on which thirds line you put your horizon on. Also, remember to keep your horizons straight. Here's a photo I've taken, and instead of putting the subject directly in the center, I moved it off to one of the third lines. Here's another photo I've taken where I put the horizon on the lower third line so I could show more of the starry sky. Another rule of composition is leading lines. They are lines that are framed by the photographer that lead the viewer in a certain direction or to a certain point in the photograph. These are just a couple of rules of composition. Once you learn all the rules, then you can decide when to break them. Here's a photo I took where I used the rows of vegetables to guide the viewer's eyes down to the tractor. Here's another photo I took where I used the road's leading lines to direct your eyes to the horizon and to the sky. Tip number 3. Once you find a subject to photograph, examine it from all angles. When I was beginning my photography journey, I'd find an interesting subject and I'd start shooting, and I'd take so many shots, and when I got home to examine all the shots, I'd realize that there was just so many of the one angle, and I'd like one shot, but then I'd have to ditch all the rest. So I suggest take your time, move around the subject, and look at it from all angles. Look at it from down on the ground or up above. Look where the light's hitting it, what shadows it's creating. Come up close to it. Crop in tight, or add other things into your frame as well if there's anything next to it. Just experiment and keep changing your position. And if you've got a tripod, move your tripod too. Extend it high, put it down low, and try and cover all angles. Tip number 4. When taking portraits of people or animals, make sure you focus on the eyes. Lock your camera's focus point on the closest eye and then recompose for how you want to take the portrait. Or compose your camera and then move the focus point to the eyes. It's always important to have the eyes sharpen in focus, as it gives the viewer a better connection with the subject. Tip number 5. Learn about light. Look at different times of the day and notice how the light changes color. How before dawn it's cool and blue, and then as the sun comes up you get warm yellows and oranges and reds, and then the day goes on, it becomes a crisp white light. Notice the length of shadows at different times of day. Look what happens when light shines on an object. Is the light reflected or is it absorbed? The color of light that is received by the camera is controlled by the white balance. The light temperature or color is measured in Kelvin, where 1000 Kelvin gives you your reds and oranges, and 10,000 Kelvin gives you your blues, like a clear blue sky. Also, look at the way light diffuses through an object. How a harsh sunshine can come through thin curtains and become soft. Yeah, there's a lot to learn about light, and I think it's a must if you want to go further in your photography. Tip number 6, get out of auto mode. Once you've learned a bit about composition, you can take the camera out of auto mode and start controlling the light the way you want to. Auto mode gives you control over the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. The shutter opens and closes to allow light to hit the sensor of your camera. The faster the speed, the less light that hits the sensor, but it will also freeze fast-moving objects. The aperture of the lens is like the pupil in our eyes. When we're in the dark, our pupils get bigger to let more light in. Look through your lens and move the aperture ring. Take note of how the opening gets bigger and smaller, letting more or less light through the lens. The ISO controls how sensitive the sensor of the camera is to light. The higher the ISO, the brighter the photo will become. A high ISO will also produce noise. This is like the old-fashioned film grain effect. It can be a little bit daunting and scary, but take the leap and get out of auto and enter manual. Tip number 7, learn editing software. By learning some sort of editing software, you'll gain greater control over your photos and a greater understanding of photography. You'll also find better ways to sort and store your photos for easy access. Some people might be hesitant to edit their photos, wanting the photo to be as natural as possible, and that's great. But remember, even the great film photographers edit their photos too, with techniques like dodging and burning, or they use different chemicals and temperatures to create more or less contrast in their photos. So when you're shooting with RAW, you're always going to need to edit your photos, even just a little bit. Tip number 8, remember to always back up your photos to an external hard drive or a cloud. I actually recommend an extra backup just in case the first one fails or is destroyed. I had a hard drive full of about a year's worth of shooting and photos, some family ones too, and it failed. So I've lost all those photos. So it's always a good idea to back them up and back them up again. And I also recommend using a smaller hard drive than a larger one for your backups, just so if you have a terabyte hard drive and it fails, you only lose a terabyte worth of photos rather than having a large 8 terabyte hard drive, and then you'd lose 8 terabytes worth of photos. There are some places that can recover your photos for you off broken hard drives, but it's not always possible, and it's very expensive, so it's best to just back them up and keep them safe. Tip number 9, look at great artists. Look at great photographers and painters. Look how they compose their pictures. Look how they use the light. Start out asking yourself what makes their work great. Try and copy what they do, even just for a time, and then you can develop your own style. Tip number 10, join a photography club. You can join a photography club either online or in your local area, and this is a great way to learn from some like-minded people. Usually there's people there with all different levels of experience, and I've found that they're always ready to help and impart knowledge onto the newer photographers. So if you look into this, look in your local area or look online, and you'll find one that suits you. Tip number 11, practice and experiment. Nowadays, with cameras not needing film, there's no reason to be cautious with how many shots you take. So when you're just starting out, experiment with your camera and its settings and learn what they do. Change your aperture and watch the background become in or out of focus. Change the shutter speed and look at the movement blur or freezing of a fast-moving object. Take note of what you change and how it affects the photo, how it affects how bright the photo gets or how dark the photo gets. Remember to just keep on practicing and keep on experimenting. Tip number 12, explore. Go on adventures to places you've never been, or go into your backyard and look at things in a way you've never done before. Go for a walk around your neighborhood and take a different path than you usually would. Your next great photo could be just around the corner. If you find a beautiful landscape location, return to it again and again until the light conditions are just right. Learn where and when the sun rises and sets, and work out when the best time of year it is for that location. Just take your camera everywhere and just keep shooting and exploring. Tip number 13, don't worry about what camera you have. A lot of the times you hear people say, oh, what sort of camera have you got, and what are you shooting with, and all that sort of thing. Just remember, it's the photographer that takes the photo, not the camera. You hear so many people also say, I love your work, you must have an amazing camera. Well, it's not the camera that takes the photo. Would you say to a chef, I love your food, you must have an amazing oven? Or an architect, I love this house, you must have an amazing pencil. It's you behind the camera that takes the great shot, not the camera itself. So when you're starting out, just use whatever you've got available to you. Tip number 14, be aware of your background. Sometimes we're so focused on our subject that we forget to check what's behind our subject. With outdoor portraits, for instance, you look out for distracting objects like other people or cars, or something that distracts from the portrait. Also look out for objects sticking out of the person's head or body, like light poles or a branch from a tree that looks like it's growing out of the person's head. So just keep an eye on your background as well as the subject. Tip number 15, and I think the most important tip, is just have fun. Enjoy what you're doing. Remember, photography is a journey, and we have to take many average photos and make many mistakes to learn how to take a great photo. Also remember, photography is an art form, and art is subjective. Some people love, say, a painting like the Mona Lisa, while other people don't like it. Doesn't mean that the painting is bad or good, it's just their personal opinions. So if you post your photos on social media or show them to people and you don't get a great reaction, don't get disheartened. If you love what you do and you love your work, then I think that's the most important thing. Just keep taking photos and keep having fun. I hope you've enjoyed these tips and learnt something about photography. Thanks for listening.